In 1978, a team of scientists spent 5 days testing a piece of medieval linen with every tool they had, hunting for paint, dye, or pigment. They found none. Whatever created the image survives only in the top two fibers of the cloth, and it carries an exact three-dimensional depth map of a human body, something no painting has ever produced before or since. Today, 10 medieval artifacts that science and history still cannot fully explain. What are they hiding, and why do the answers keep falling apart? Number 10. The Shroud of Turin, a piece of linen cloth, 14 feet long, folded away in a silver reliquary inside a cathedral in Turin, Italy, carries an image that has resisted explanation for centuries. The cloth is kept in near darkness most of the year, brought into the light only for brief, ceremonial viewings, and even then the room around it tends to fall quiet in a way that has little to do with any rule posted on the wall. Held up to the light, it shows the faint, ghostly outline of a man who appears to have been crucified, his wounds arranged with an anatomical precision no medieval artist is known to have possessed. Wrists pierced through the joint rather than the palm, a wound in the side consistent with a spear driven upward between the ribs, dozens of smaller marks scattered across the back, and shoulders in a pattern that matches the fall of a multi-tailed whip. The image itself is faint and brownish, almost invisible up close, little more than a stain in the weave of old fabric, and only resolves into a coherent human form when viewed from several feet away, as though it were built to be seen rather than examined, as though whoever or whatever made it never intended for a person to press their nose against the threads and hunt for brushstrokes. The cloth first appears in written history in the town of Liéry, in France, sometime between 1354 and 1357, a modest rural parish that suddenly found itself the custodian of one of the most sought-after pilgrimage objects in Christendom. Crowds are recorded traveling considerable distances on foot to file past it, in an age when the display of relics was as much a part of daily religious life as prayer itself, and when a single cloth or bone fragment could reshape the fortunes of an entire town. Yet even then, a local bishop already denounced it as a forgery and claimed to know the man responsible for painting it, though no confession, no signature, and no workshop record has ever surfaced to back that claim, only his written word against 6 centuries of silence. In 1988, 3 independent laboratories, working separately in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona, carbon-dated small samples of the cloth using a method that measures the slow decay of radioactive carbon locked inside organic fibers, since the flax plant was harvested and woven, and each one arrived at a range between 1260 and 1390, placing its origin squarely inside the medieval period. The cathedral claims it predates by well over 1,000 years. That result should have closed the case. Instead, it deepened it. 10 years earlier, a team of American scientists calling themselves the Shroud of Turin Research Project had been granted access few outsiders ever receive, working around the clock in a temporary lab set up beside the relic itself, spending 5 days examining the cloth with microscopes, spectrometers, and ultraviolet photography under conditions closer to a criminal forensics unit than a church archive. They found no trace of paint, pigment, dye, or brushstroke anywhere on its surface, nothing pooled in the low points of the weave the way any applied medium inevitably does. Whatever produced the image did not sit on top of the linen the way ink or paint does. It exists only within the outermost few micrometers of the threads themselves, a discoloration so shallow that a single fingernail could scrape it away entirely, thinner than the finest medieval illuminator could ever have laid a line. Here is the detail that keeps researchers awake at night. When scientists ran the image through software originally built to read elevation data from satellite photographs, software designed to translate brightness into distance so that a flat picture of terrain could be turned into a 3-dimensional map of hills and valleys, The shroud produced a coherent, three-dimensional relief map of a human body, a correct nose, a correct brow line, a correct chest contour rising and falling exactly the way a real face and torso would beneath a draped cloth. Feed a photograph or a painting into that same software, and you get meaningless noise, a flat blur of nonsense, because ordinary images carry no distance information at all, only patterns of light and shadow that any camera or brush can fake. The shroud, for reasons nobody has ever managed to replicate, carries actual depth encoded into its stain. No known medieval technique does that, and decades of attempts to reproduce the effect using period pigments, natural dyes, or even crude early photographic methods borrowed from the earliest days of the camera have all fallen short in one way or another. Close in appearance, but never able to fool the elevation software the way the original does. The leading modern hypothesis, and it remains only a hypothesis, holds that the image was seared into the fibers by a single, instantaneous burst of radiation, something in the ultraviolet range far more powerful than anything a medieval workshop, lit by tallow candles and daylight through narrow windows, could have generated by any means available to it. Nobody proposing this theory claims to know what could have produced such a burst inside a locked reliquary, sealed away from any furnace, forge, or open flame capable of that kind of energy. Meanwhile, a separate argument has taken hold that the 14th century carbon date itself may be flawed, not because the testing was done incorrectly, but because the sample cut for testing may have come from a corner of the cloth rewoven during a medieval repair, stitched in after a fire scorched the shroud, a common fate for relics kept for centuries near open flame and incense, rather than from the original weave. If that argument holds, the true age of the fabric beneath the image has never actually been measured at all, and every laboratory result to date may describe nothing more than a patch sewn on generations after the image itself was already old. So the cloth sits in Turin, studied by more scientists with more equipment than perhaps any textile in human history, X-rayed, photographed under every wavelength of light known to instruments, and it still will not give up its secret. Not how the image was formed, not with any real certainty how old the linen underneath it actually is. It waits behind its silver door the way it has waited through wars, fires, and the rise and fall of the very science built to explain it. Whatever guards this secret has had 6 centuries of practice at keeping its silence, but at least the shroud never lied about what happened to the man woven into it, every wound consistent with every other wound, a single coherent story of suffering. The next name on this list belonged to a real man, murdered in cold blood on ordinary ground, and hidden so completely that history very nearly let his killer walk free forever. Number 9. The Bocksten Man. In 1936, workers cutting peat from a bog near the town of Varberg, on the western coast of Sweden, uncovered something that was not turf. Peat cutting was slow, unglamorous labor, the kind done season after season by hand in cold, waterlogged ground, and the men doing it that day were used to pulling up nothing more remarkable than dense black fuel. Instead, they found a human skeleton, still wrapped in the remains of its clothing, pinned to the floor of the bog by wooden stakes driven straight through the body. The peat had done what peat does to organic remains left in cold, oxygen-starved water, tanning the skin, and preserving the wool in a slow chemical embrace that can hold a body almost intact for hundreds of years, leaving behind a man dressed almost as well as the day he died, as if he had simply lain down in the dark water the night before. And he had been dressed well. His clothing, a long hooded coat, hose, and a well-made pair of shoes, was cut from good quality wool, tailored rather than crude, the kind of outfit that marked its wearer as a man of some means, neither a peasant nor a pauper, someone who could afford cloth beyond the rough homespun most people of the era wore against the cold. Analysis of the garments and the condition of the remains placed his death somewhere in the 14th century, the same restless century that brought famine, plague, and near-constant local warfare across Scandinavia. A period when even a man of standing could vanish from the road and never be missed by anyone with the power to demand answers. The manner of his death removed any question of accident. His skull carried 3 separate, forceful blows, any one of which would have been enough to kill him outright, delivered with a force that suggests more than one strike was needed to be certain the job was finished. That alone might describe an ordinary act of violence, brutal but explainable, the kind of roadside killing that history simply swallows without comment. What happened next did not. After he was already dead, or dying, someone drove wooden stakes through his body and through his clothing, pinning him into the peat itself, anchoring him at the bottom of the bog, so that he could never rise, never be discovered, never be given a proper grave in consecrated ground the way custom and faith demanded of the dead. This was not a killing followed by a hurried burial. It was a killing followed by a ritual of concealment, carried out with time, tools, and clear intention, the kind of care that speaks less of panic than of someone determined to make absolutely sure the body, and whatever it might have said, stayed exactly where it was put. For almost 700 years, the bog kept that secret whole, the cold, acidic water sealing away not just a body but every trace of the choice made over it. When his body finally surfaced, in the hands of peat cutters rather than grave robbers, he carried a name only through guesswork. Local historians, working from monastery and church records of missing clergy from the region, the kind of careful ledgers medieval institutions kept of their own personnel, proposed that he might have been a man named Simon Gudmundsson, a church official known as a dean who reportedly vanished around that same period, possibly murdered by a rival hoping to claim his position. A plausible enough motive in an era when church offices carried real income and real power worth killing for. It is a tidy theory. It has never been proven. No document places Simon Gudmundsson in that specific bog, and no trial record or confession has ever surfaced naming a killer. Only the coincidence of a missing churchman and a body dressed like one. What researchers do agree on is that modern genetic testing, applied to remains this well-preserved, so well-preserved that hair, skin, and fabric all survived intact across 7 centuries, may someday offer the only real path to confirming who he truly was, and by extension, who wanted him silenced badly enough to stake his body into the bottom of a swamp. Until that testing happens, or until it fails to answer the question, the man in the bog remains exactly what he has been since 1936, a well-dressed stranger, killed with excessive and deliberate cruelty, and never once identified. The Bocksten Man keeps his silence in death, unable even now to name his own killer. But at least that silence was forced on him by someone else. The next mystery on this list has been silent from the very moment it was written, a document composed entirely in a language of its own invention, and in 600 years, not one linguist, not one historian, not even the finest military code breakers of the 20th century, has ever gotten it to say a single word back. Number 8. The Voynich Manuscript. Imagine a small book, roughly the size of a modern paperback, easy enough to hold in one hand, but heavier somehow once you understand what it is. Its pages are made of soft goatskin vellum, scraped and stretched and dried by hands that have been dust for 600 years, and every one of those pages is filled edge to edge with flowing, confident handwriting in an alphabet nobody on this planet has ever been able to read. Run your eye down a line of it, and the shapes almost resolve into familiar letters, and then they do not. The scribe never hesitates, never smudges, never seems to search for the next symbol the way a forger inventing gibberish on the spot would. Beside the text sit illustrations that feel like they were copied from somewhere just outside the edge of the known world, root systems that belong to no known plant, tangled and bulbous and wrong in ways a real botanist would notice immediately. Wheels of stars and zodiac symbols circling like something plotted from an unfamiliar sky, and rows of naked women standing waist-deep in green liquid, connected by a plumbing of pipes and tub that looks more like the inside of some strange biological machine than any bathhouse Europe ever built. Turn enough pages, and the book stops feeling like a medieval curiosity and starts feeling like a message left behind by someone who was not writing for us at all, someone writing only for themselves, or for one other reader who is long gone. Picture the room where a page like this would have first been studied, a shuttered window letting in thin daylight, a single candle throwing long shadows across the desk, the smell of tallow smoke and old skin, and a reader running a fingertip under lines of a script that refuses, even up close, even in good light, to give up a single certain word. Scientists at the University of Arizona ran radiocarbon dating on the vellum itself, the physical skin the words are written on, and traced its origin to somewhere between 1404 and 1438, placing its creation firmly in the early 15th century, in the middle of a Europe still stitching itself back together after waves of plague, in an age when a book like this, hand-copied, hand-illustrated, hand-bound, represented months or years of somebody's working life. Then the trail goes quiet. Almost 200 years of silence, no mention, no owner's name, nothing, until the book resurfaces in Prague at the start of the 1600s, passing through the hands of a Holy Roman Emperor's court, a place thick with alchemists and astrologers and men chasing forbidden knowledge, before disappearing again into private libraries and Jesuit archives, tucked away on some shelf, unread, for generation after generation. It stayed buried in that kind of obscurity until 1912, when a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich bought a stack of old manuscripts from a Jesuit college in Italy, the kind of routine acquisition a dealer makes 100 times in a career, and found this one hiding among them out of place, unlike anything else in the pile. He spent the rest of his life trying to learn what it said, showing it to scholars, writing letters, chasing leads that always dissolved into nothing. He never did, neither has anyone since. For more than a century, the sharpest minds in cryptography have thrown themselves at this text and walked away empty-handed. Picture the sheer range of people who have tried. Amateur codebreakers scribbling theories in notebooks late at night, university linguists running statistical models no medieval scribe could have imagined, even the code-breaking teams who cracked Axis ciphers during the Second World War, working under wartime pressure with the fate of nations riding on their skill, and later analysts connected to the National Security Agency, professionals trained on the hardest ciphers a modern state can produce. All of them took a run at it. All of them failed to produce a translation that other experts would accept. That is the detail that should stop you cold. This is not a puzzle nobody has bothered to try. It is a puzzle that the best code breakers in modern history have tried to solve. People who broke the secrets of entire armies, with the full weight of 20th century cryptanalysis behind them, and a 500-year-old book beat every one of them. Here is the strangest twist. A peer-reviewed study published in the journal Cryptologia found that a cipher achievable with medieval technology, nothing more advanced than what a clever 15th century mind could build with pen and patience, could, statistically, reproduce the unusual letter patterns found in the Voynich text, patterns that look almost, but not quite, like a real language, the way a word looks almost right a half-second before you realize it is misspelled. That finding suggests this is probably not gibberish, not an elaborate hoax, not a bored monk doodling nonsense to pass a long winter. There is very likely a genuine message locked inside those pages, built by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. But knowing that a code could exist is not the same as breaking it, and to this day, not one proposed decryption has been confirmed or widely accepted by the scholars who study it. We know, with real confidence, that someone hid something here on purpose. We still have no idea what it says. But a text nobody can read is, in its own way, a quiet mystery, a locked door with no visible keyhole, something that keeps its secret simply by staying silent. The next object on this list is not quiet at all. It does not whisper, it looms. It is enormous. It is soaked in a legend about a monk who sold his soul to finish it in a single night. And it is heavy enough that it takes real effort just to lift the cover, let alone turn its pages. Number 7. Codex Gigas, the Devil's Bible. Picture a book so large it needs 2 people to carry it properly. The kind of object that makes a modern reader's arms ache just imagining the weight. Its cover thick enough to stop a blade, bound in leather that has survived war and fire and centuries of hands. Open it, and right in the middle of its pages sits a full-length portrait of the devil himself, staring out in vivid color from a page otherwise dominated by careful, patient script, horns curling up from his head, tongue out, crouched like something that might climb off the vellum if the candlelight flickered wrong. This is not a small, quiet manuscript hidden in a drawer somewhere. This is a monument bound in leather, and it has been terrifying and fascinating people for 800 years, sitting in the middle of European history like a boulder nobody can quite move. The Codex Gigas was created sometime between about 1204 and 1230 in a Benedictine monastery in Podlages, in Bohemia, in what is now the Czech Republic, in the kind of stone building where monks rose in darkness, prayed on a fixed schedule through the night and day, and spent their remaining hours in near silence, copying and illuminating manuscripts by hand, because that silence and repetition was itself considered a form of devotion. It measures roughly 92 centimeters tall and weighs close to 75 kilograms, making it the largest surviving illuminated manuscript from the medieval world, an entire library's worth of text, history, medicine, and scripture, bound into one single volume that a single monastery would have guarded like treasure. The vellum alone required the skins of around 160 animals, which means somewhere behind this book stands the quiet, unglamorous labor of raising, slaughtering, scraping, stretching, and curing enough hide to fill a small herd, long before a single letter was ever written. And here is the detail that stops historians cold. Handwriting analysis across every single page, thousands of them, points to one person. Not a workshop of monks trading pages between them. Not a team of scribes working in shifts to speed the labor along, the way most great manuscripts of the era were built. One man, alone, bent over vellum in flickering candlelight. For years, in a scriptorium that would otherwise have echoed with the scratch of many quills, the creak of benches, the low murmur of brothers at their separate tasks, all of it going quiet around this one desk where a single hand kept moving long after everyone else had stopped for the night. Legend grew up around that lonely portrait of the devil almost immediately, the way legends always seem to fill in the space where the true story feels impossible on its own. The story goes that the monk who created the book had broken his vows and was sentenced to be sealed alive inside the monastery wall as punishment, a fate meant to be certain and final, and in a desperate bid to save his own life, he offered his brothers something enormous in exchange for mercy. He would write an entire encyclopedia of human knowledge in a single night. When he realized, deep into that impossible night, that he could never finish in time, he begged for help, and the devil himself is said to have appeared and finished the book for him, in exchange for having his portrait included inside it forever, a signature scrawled in ink instead of blood. It is a chilling story, the kind told in whispers by candlelight for generations, but the real math behind the book is arguably more disturbing than the legend, because it points to something a single human being actually endured with no devil to help him at all. Historians estimate that writing the text alone, working continuously day and night without rest, would have taken roughly 5 years, And that estimate is before accounting for the elaborate illustrations, the decorated initials, and the corrections layered carefully through the manuscript. A far more realistic estimate stretches the true creation time across 20 to 30 years, meaning one monk likely devoted a significant portion of his entire adult life, sitting hunched over vellum by candlelight in that cold stone monastery, hearing the same prayers repeated at the same hours every single day, to build this single object by hand. The legend claims one impossible night powered by a demon. The truth is a quieter, stranger horror. One man's decades, spent in near total isolation, dedicated to a single unbroken task, for a book that would go on to outlive him by 8 centuries and counting. One monk's endurance is a mystery written in flesh and time, the slow, grinding proof of what a human body can survive in service of an obsession nobody fully explained. The next object on this list trades that mystery for a different one entirely, forged not in patience but in fire, a blade of a purity and hardness that medieval Europe, by every account we have, should not have been capable of producing yet. Number 6. The Ulfberht Swords. Picture a Viking longship cutting through gray water, oars creaking in their locks, salt spray freezing on the wool cloaks of the men rowing it. Somewhere on that ship, mixed in among ordinary shields and ordinary knives, is a weapon that does not belong. In the hands of the warrior standing at the prow, a blade catches the light differently than the others around it. Lighter, straighter. Under a gray northern sky, the metal has a dull, silvery shine that the crude iron of the era never quite holds. Bend it, and instead of staying bent or snapping, it springs back like it remembers its own shape. The other warriors notice it too. They always do. In a world where a sword could mean the difference between walking home or being carried, a blade like that was worth more than gold, worth more than land, worth more than almost anything else a man could own. Since the 1800s, archaeologists have pulled around 170 of these swords out of rivers, graves, and battlefields scattered across Europe, from Norway to the Volga region. They date from roughly the year 800 to 1100, the heart of the Viking Age, that stretch of centuries when Norse raiders, traders, and settlers pushed outward from Scandinavia along every river and coastline they could reach. And every single one of these swords carries the same strange signature, forged directly into the fuller of the blade in raised iron letters that read, plus, the name Ulfberht, plus, not scratched on afterward, built into the steel itself, as if the maker wanted it to survive as long as the sword did. Nobody agrees on who Ulfberht actually was. A master smith working alone. A workshop brand passed down through generations of apprentices, the way so many trade secrets moved in that period. Possibly even a name stolen and stamped onto inferior copies by rival smiths hoping to cash in on the reputation. Because historians have also found fakes, blades with the name misspelled or badly copied, made from ordinary iron that would have shattered in a real fight. But the real ones are the mystery, and the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. When metallurgists finally ran the genuine Ulfberht blades through modern lab analysis, cutting cross-sections, studying the grain of the metal under magnification, the results did not make sense for the era that produced them. The steel had a carbon content as high as 1.6%, almost 3 times higher than the crude, slag-riddled iron typically hammered into swords at the time. Iron so impure it was closer to raw ore than refined metal. This is what metallurgists call hyper-eutectoid steel, a grade of purity and strength that would not become standard in European sword-making for another several hundred years. Modern engineers, looking at the same samples, have compared its quality to spring steel used in industrial machinery, a material built to flex under enormous stress without failing. Here is the detail worth sitting with, because it is the moment this stops being a curiosity and becomes a genuine puzzle. To produce steel this pure, you need to melt the ore completely, Not just heat and hammer it the way every other blacksmith in Northern Europe did, and that requires temperatures around 1600 degrees Celsius, close to 3000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to turn solid iron into liquid. Based on everything we know about early medieval European furnace technology, the low, smoky bloomery furnaces of the Viking Age, fed by hand bellows and charcoal, could not reach anywhere near that heat. They were built to soften iron, to make it workable under a hammer, never to melt it outright. So the question becomes brutally simple, the kind of question that should have a simple answer and does not. If Norse smiths could not melt steel that pure, where did the steel come from? The leading theory, and it is still just that, a theory, points east, far beyond the fjords and forests where these swords were carried. Historians believe the raw material may have been crucible steel imported from the Islamic world, a variety sometimes called woots, famous even then for producing blades of extraordinary strength and flexibility. That steel would have traveled an almost unbelievable distance for its time, down through Central Asia, across the Caspian region, and up the Volga trade route, a corridor of rivers and portages that connected the Islamic caliphates to Scandinavia through a long chain of ruse traders and river ports. And here is the piece of the puzzle that makes this more than speculation, the detail that turns a good guess into something closer to evidence. The known production window of Ulfberht Swords lines up, almost year for year, with the centuries when the Volga trade route was open and active, when goods and ideas could still move freely between the Islamic world and the Norse one. When that route collapsed, when the trade networks connecting the Viking world to the Islamic world broke down under the weight of shifting politics and warfare, the genuine Ulfberht swords stop appearing in the archaeological record entirely. Not gradually, not tapering off the way you would expect a fading fashion to fade. They just end, as if a door somewhere far to the east had quietly closed. Historians are careful here, because ending a trade route does not, by itself, prove where a specific ingot of steel came from centuries ago, and good scholarship resists the temptation to fill a gap with a clean, satisfying story. The consensus is that imported crucible steel remains the most plausible explanation, but the exact supply chain, the specific smiths involved, and how a Norse workshop learned to work steel that advanced without leaving behind a single record of the process. No ledger, no letter, no apprentice's account. All of that is still argued over in academic journals today. So somewhere between the Middle East and the Arctic Circle, a technology existed that Europe would not rediscover for centuries, carried in secret, or at least in silence, across rivers and mountain passes, hammered into weapons that outclassed everything else on the battlefield, and then vanished so completely that we only know it existed because a handful of corroded blades happened to survive in the mud, waiting 1,000 years for someone with a lab and a microscope to notice what they were actually looking at. But at least with the Ulfberht swords, we know what we are looking at, a weapon, a name, a trade route we can trace on a map, even if the details stay stubbornly out of reach. The next object on this list does not even give us that much. It is a fortune in gold, torn apart and buried in a hurry, and nobody has ever agreed on why. Number 5. The Staffordshire Hoard. A man walks a farmer's field in Staffordshire, England, sweeping a metal detector back and forth out of habit more than hope, the kind of quiet, unremarkable afternoon that thousands of hobbyists spend combing empty fields for bottle caps and horseshoes. Then the machine screams. He digs down a few inches through ordinary English topsoil and pulls out a twisted scrap of gold. Then another, each one bent and crushed in ways that make no sense for jewelry someone simply lost. By the time archaeologists finish excavating that field in the year 2009, working carefully through the soil layer by layer, they have recovered the largest hoard of Anglo-Saxon gold ever discovered, anywhere, ever. 5 kilograms of gold, 1.3 kilograms of silver, more than 4,600 individual pieces and fragments, an amount of precious metal that, in its own era, could have paid for armies. What makes the find so eerie is not just the scale of it, it is what the objects actually are. Almost none of it is jewelry. Almost none of it is coinage, the kind of thing you would expect a wealthy person to bury for safekeeping. It is war gear, sword pommels, helmet fragments, and fittings ripped violently off their original weapons, folded, crushed, and crammed into the ground with no apparent care for preserving their beauty, no attempt to lay the pieces out with any dignity or order. Someone tore apart what was likely the accumulated wealth of an entire warband, weapons that would have been carried into battle, worn as a mark of rank and loyalty, and then buried the pieces like they were disposing of evidence rather than hiding treasure to come back for. The hoard has been dated to somewhere between the years 650 and 675, placing it right in the brutal, fractured world of early Anglo-Saxon England, an age of warring kingdoms constantly raiding and absorbing one another, shifting alliances that could turn overnight, and a slow, uneasy conversion from the old gods to Christianity, two belief systems overlapping and colliding in the same generation. That context matters, because buried among the war gear are objects that do not belong with soldiers at all, objects that seem to have wandered in from an entirely different part of that world. Here is the detail that archaeologists still cannot fully explain. One item recovered from the hoard is a small, folded strip of gold inlaid with garnets, the deep red stones so common in the finest metalwork of the period, along with what may be a fragment from an ecclesiastical headdress, the kind of ornament worn by a bishop or a high-ranking churchman rather than a warrior. Nobody knows for certain what these pieces originally were, because the only close visual comparison researchers have ever found is an illustration in a manuscript from roughly the same period, showing the biblical figure Ezra wearing a similarly shaped headpiece, seated and dressed in the ceremonial garments of a religious scholar. That is the entire trail. One old drawing, faded and centuries removed from the object itself, and a mangled scrap of gold that might, just might, match it. Named archaeologists like Chris Fern, who has spent years cataloging and studying the collection piece by piece, still cannot say with confidence why an object like this was mixed in with stripped-down sword fittings and buried in a field far from any known royal site or battlefield. Was it treasure taken as tribute, wealth handed over to buy peace or loyalty? Was it ransom paid to buy off an enemy before a battle no one wanted to fight? Was it plunder stripped from the dead after a massacre, gathered up in the chaos that followed a war camp's destruction? Or was it a ritual offering, gold given to the earth itself in a gesture nobody alive today can interpret, a practice with roots stretching back into the older, pre-Christian world that the region was only just beginning to leave behind? Researchers can only guess, and the guesses do not agree. And the part that unsettles historians most is not any single object. It is the silence around all of it. Whoever buried this fortune never came back for it. Not in a year, not in a generation, not ever. In a world where gold like this represented power, loyalty, and survival itself, where a single sword fitting could mark a man as a king's favored warrior, someone walked away from the equivalent of a king's ransom and let it sit in the dirt for over 1,000 years. Through the fall of kingdoms, the arrival of new invaders, and the slow forgetting of everyone who might have known the truth. At least the Staffordshire Hoard gives us a mood, gold stripped in violence and buried in haste, the fingerprints of a war we can almost picture even without knowing its name. The next object on this list was made with the opposite of haste. It was carved with patience, with total mastery, in total calm, and to this day nobody has ever agreed on whose hands actually made it. Number 4. The Lewis Chessmen. Picture a chess set carved from walrus tusk, 93 pieces in all, kings and queens with wide startled eyes, bishops gripping their staffs, and rooks that are not towers at all but wild-eyed berserkers biting the edges of their own shields. The ivory has gone the color of old parchment now, smoothed in places by centuries in the ground, rough and pitted in others, where the sand worked its way into every crevice of the carving. Now picture that entire set buried in a sand dune on a remote Scottish island, with no box, no note, no burial, nothing to explain why anyone would leave a small fortune of medieval artistry in the ground and simply walk away. That is exactly what happened on the Isle of Lewis, off the coast of Scotland in 1831. Picture the scene: a windswept stretch of coastline where the sea never really stops moving, grass bent flat by a wind that comes off the North Atlantic and never seems to rest, and beneath the dry crust of a sandbank, packed in like it had been hidden in a hurry. A local man, according to the traditional account, stumbled onto the hoard inside that sandbank, and what he found stopped being a curiosity the moment scholars got a proper look at it. Chess had already been played across medieval Europe for generations by then, imported originally from further east and reshaped along the way into pieces any European court would recognize: bishops instead of elephants, queens instead of viziers. The carving style, the fine detail in the faces, the way the ivory was worked, all of it pointed to roughly the 12th century, a full 600 years before anyone rediscovered them. 4 of the pieces were not walrus ivory at all but whale tooth, which only deepened the puzzle, since it suggested more than one batch of material, and possibly more than one workshop, went into the finished set. Here is the detail that makes forensic historians uneasy even now. When researchers examined the tool marks left behind on the ivory, the tiny grooves and cut patterns invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable under magnification, the kind of evidence you only see once you put a blade edge and a microscope to work on something that has sat quietly in a museum drawer for generations. They found the signatures of at least 4 or 5 different hands, different carvers, different tools, quite possibly different years of work, all producing pieces that were meant to belong to the same set. That is not how you make a chess set for a single household, tucked away for a lord's private amusement on some long winter evening. That is how you make something meant to be traded, gifted, perhaps even commissioned as a diplomatic prize, moved from workshop to workshop until a full 93 pieces stood ready. So who carved them? For decades, the leading theory pointed to workshops in Trondheim, Norway, a major center of walrus ivory carving in the medieval period, when Norse traders and hunters pushed north into Arctic waters for tusks that were, piece for piece, nearly as valuable as gold further south, and most historians still lean that direction today. But one persistent and genuinely debated theory names a specific individual, an Icelandic craftswoman mentioned in the sagas named Margaret the Adroit, celebrated in her own time for ivory work of extraordinary quality, at a period when named female artisans rarely survive in any written record at all. If she or her workshop is responsible, it would mean one of the most famous artifacts in British museum collections was made not by anonymous Norwegian monks working in some cold coastal workshop, but by a named woman working in Iceland, a claim that would rewrite a small but meaningful piece of medieval craft history, and quietly correct centuries of assuming the hands behind great medieval art were always male. Almost 200 years after that sandbank in Lewis gave up its secret, the debate has not been settled. The British Museum, which holds most of the pieces under carefully controlled light, designed to keep centuries-old ivory from degrading any further, and the National Museum of Scotland, which holds the rest, both present the Trondheim theory as most likely while acknowledging the Margaret hypothesis has never been disproven. Visitors who stand in front of the display cases today see the pieces exactly as they were carved, the same startled kings, the same shield biters frozen mid-rage, lit under glass in a quiet room a very long way from the windswept dune where they were found. No workshop records survive. No maker's mark was ever carved into the ivory. The chessmen simply exist, staring out with those wide, unsettling eyes, refusing to say who made them or why they ended up buried and forgotten on a Scottish beach, waiting for something or someone that never came back for them. But at least with the Lewis Chessmen, we are only arguing about who held the knife. The next object on this list raises a stranger question entirely, not who made it, but why it was carried across an entire continent to be buried with a king who, as far as anyone can tell, had no reason to want it there at all. Number 3. The Sutton Hoo Bitumen. In the summer of 1939, on the eve of a war that would consume Europe, archaeologists in the English countryside were carefully lifting the earth away from a ghost. There was no time to waste. The excavation raced against a clock nobody spoke about directly, the sense that the world above ground was about to change completely. And still, the team worked with brushes and trowels rather than shovels, coaxing centuries out of the soil one careful layer at a time. The wooden hull of an entire ship, 90 feet long, had long since rotted into nothing, leaving behind only its rust-colored imprint in the sand, like a photograph developed in soil. Every rivet and plank line preserved in stain, even though the wood itself had vanished generations before anyone thought to dig there. Inside that ship was one of the richest burials ever found in Britain, gold buckles catching what little sun made it through an English summer sky, a ceremonial helmet built to make its wearer look less than fully human, silver bowls from the eastern Mediterranean that had clearly crossed a continent before they ever crossed the North Sea, and tucked near the head and feet of where the body would have lain, small black lumps that at the time nobody thought much about. Those lumps sat in storage for decades, catalogued simply as tar or pitch, assumed to be some local waterproofing material used in the ship itself, the sort of unglamorous detail that gets a brief note in a catalog, and then nothing else for a very long time. Then, in 2016, researchers ran a full chemical analysis on the material, the kind of test that did not exist when the ship was first excavated. The results did not match anything in Britain. They matched bitumen deposits from what is now Syria, a source thousands of miles away, with no known trade route in the early 7th century that would explain why a lump of Middle Eastern tar ended up buried alongside an Anglo-Saxon king in the English countryside, at a time when most people in that part of the world would live and die without ever traveling more than a few days' walk from where they were born. The burial itself dates to the early 600s, likely connected to Redwold, king of the East Angles, one of the most powerful rulers in England at the time, a man who ruled in an age when kingdoms were still small, fragile, and stitched together by war bands and personal loyalty rather than any settled state. Historians have long known that Sutton Hoo shows evidence of contact with the wider world, Byzantine silver, garnets that may have traveled from as far as India or Sri Lanka, proof that even in an age of short journeys and local horizons, luxury goods still found their way to the edge of the known world. But bitumen specifically sourced from Syria is a different kind of evidence, because it suggests not just trade goods passing hand to hand along a chain of merchants, each one adding a small markup and never traveling the whole distance themselves, but something closer to direct contact, someone who had actually been there. That brings us to the detail nobody expected. In January of 2025, researchers from Oxford University put forward a theory that reframes the entire burial. Their proposal is that Anglo-Saxon warriors served as mercenaries within the Byzantine army during its wars against the Sasanian Persians in the late 500s, fighting on a front line most people never imagine English soldiers reaching in this period. In deserts and fortress cities half a world away from the cold, wet fields, these men would have called home. If the theory holds, that bitumen is not simply an imported trade good passed along by strangers. It may be a physical souvenir, carried home by a warrior who marched with Rome's Eastern legions and returned with proof of where he had been, a fragment of a war fought under a foreign sun, later placed in the grave of a king he served, perhaps as a mark of the distance that warrior had traveled and returned from alive. Nobody has proven the mercenary theory beyond doubt, and Oxford researchers themselves describe it as the most compelling explanation currently available rather than a settled fact. What is settled is the chemistry. That bitumen really did come from Syria, and there really is no easy explanation for how it got into an English ship burial otherwise. Think about how easily this piece of evidence could have vanished. A few small dark lumps easily mistaken for waterlogged debris, easily discarded by anyone less careful than the archaeologists who bagged and labeled every fragment before the site was closed for the coming war. The tar sat quietly in a museum drawer for the better part of a century, unlabeled in any meaningful sense, before anyone thought to ask where, exactly, it had traveled from. Sutton Hoo's tar at least tells us where an English soldier might have marched, thousands of miles east, into wars most people never connect to Anglo-Saxon Britain. The next object on this list seems to have traveled even further, all the way from a religion nobody in Viking Age Norway had ever encountered. Except, according to the archaeologists who study it, that is not quite what happened at all, and that is where this gets stranger. Number 2. The Oseberg Buddha Bucket. Picture a wooden ship being pulled out of blue Norwegian clay after 11 centuries underground, its timbers dark and swollen with water, its prow still carved into a coiling serpent that seems to glare back at daylight for the first time since it was buried. The air around the dig smells of wet earth and old wood, the kind of damp, mineral smell that clings to anything pulled out of clay after 1,000 years in the dark. Excavators work slowly, brushing soil away in thin layers, because the same waterlogged ground that crushed the ship flat also sealed it from the air that would have rotted it centuries ago. Inside the hull, packed among carts, sledges, and chests meant to furnish someone for the next world, sits a small wooden bucket, unremarkable at a glance next to the grander, more ornate objects around it. Its wood has gone soft and pale with age, the grain raised and fuzzy under careful fingers, but the bronze fittings around its handle have not softened at all. Cleaned of a century of clay and green corrosion, they still catch the light exactly the way they were meant to. And when archaeologists first worked that corrosion loose with brushes and patience, they found something nobody expected to see on a Viking ship. The bucket was pulled from the ground in 1904, from a burial mound near the town of Oseberg in Norway, a low green hill that had sat quietly over its cargo for over 1,000 years while the seasons turned above it. The mound held an entire ship, clinker-built, its overlapping planks fitted and riveted by hands that expected this vessel to matter in another life, packed with grave goods, and dated by researchers to around the year 834, placing it right at the beginning of the Viking Age, before the raids on Britain had even properly begun. It is still considered one of the richest ship burials ever recovered from that era, a genuine time capsule of carts, sledges, tapestries, and tools, and among its dozens of everyday objects, buckets, boxes, tools worn smooth by use, one single yew-wood bucket stood apart from everything surrounding it. Its handle mounts were cast in bronze with real skill, the metal smoothed and detailed rather than crude, and each one showed a small human figure, seated cross-legged, palms resting quietly on its knees, spine straight, eyes closed in an expression somewhere between rest and concentration. To museum visitors decades later, to journalists chasing a good headline, and eventually to generations of amateur historians passing the story along, the pose was unmistakable. It looked exactly like a seated Buddha, the same calm, folded posture found on temple statues thousands of miles away across Asia, carved by people who had never heard of a Norwegian fjord. For decades, that resemblance did real work in the public imagination, repeated in books and lecture halls long after the initial excitement of the dig had faded. If Viking-age Norwegians were burying a bucket shaped like a Buddhist figure, then maybe Norse traders, or captives, or middlemen scattered along some half-forgotten route, had reached far closer to Asia than any saga or church record ever admitted out loud. The bucket became a favorite talking point for anyone who wanted to argue that the Viking world was stranger and wider than the textbooks allowed, stretching a known trade network of furs, silver, and slaves all the way toward the Silk Road. Centuries before it was supposedly even possible for a Scandinavian farmer to know that world existed. Then the metal itself was studied properly, under better lighting than any 19th-century museum case, with tools and comparative collections nobody in 1904 had access to. Analysis of the casting technique, the fine enamel work pressed into the bronze, and the specific decorative style points not to Buddhist South Asia at all, but to Christian monastic workshops in Ireland or Britain, the same insular tradition that produced ornate reliquaries, book covers, and church fittings across the British Isles in those centuries. The seated figure almost certainly was never meant to represent the Buddha in the first place. Its resemblance is very likely coincidence, a shared human instinct for how a calm, seated body should look when an artist wants to suggest stillness, echoed independently on opposite sides of the world by people who never once compared notes. So the exotic version of the mystery is closed, and closed for good. But shut that door, and a quieter one swings open right behind it. Because if this bucket was made in a monastery workshop in Ireland or Britain, then somehow, across open water, across a stretch of sea Norse ships were already crossing for reasons of their own, it ended up buried with high-status Norwegian women, as one of the most personal, carefully chosen objects packed into the entire ship. Was it looted in a raid on a monastery? The kind Norse raiders were already carrying out along those very coastlines around that same era. Was it traded hand to hand along a route no record survives of? Was it gifted between households, or inherited, and carried west as a keepsake nobody wrote down the story of? Nobody has answered that with certainty, and nobody probably ever will. And here is the detail nobody quite explains, the one that turns a pretty bronze fitting into a genuine puzzle. Every other container recovered from that ship, chests, boxes, other buckets standing nearby in the same packed hold, held something. Food residue pressed into the wood grain, tools worn from handling, scraps of fabric, some small trace of the life it once served. This one bucket, the one carrying a foreign, sacred-looking figure on its handle, was completely empty when it came out of the clay. Yew wood is mildly toxic, unsuitable for storing food or drink safely, a fact any Viking-age household would have known from hard experience, which raises an obvious question that nobody has closed the file on. Why keep a container you cannot safely use for its obvious purpose, carry it across the sea from a foreign workshop, and then bury it beside two women, deliberately emptied of whatever it once might have held? Ritual object, symbolic offering meant to travel empty into the next world. Simple oversight lost to time and to us. Historians can only guess, turning the same bronze figure over in their hands the way visitors did a century ago, no closer to an answer. If a small, empty bucket with a stranger's face on its handle can rewrite assumptions about Viking-age contact with the wider world, and still keep its real purpose a secret buried under 1,000 years of clay, imagine what happens when the mystery moves off a ship and onto dry land entirely, into a farmer's field in the middle of America, where a stone slab is about to claim that Norse explorers got there first, long before anyone else supposedly could have. Number 1. The Kensington Runestone. A Minnesota field in late autumn, the grass gone brittle and pale, roots of a stubborn tree wrapped tight around a slab of gray stone, half buried in dark, cold soil that has not seen daylight in generations. A farmer kneels beside it in the thin autumn light, breath visible in the air, brushing away dirt with bare hands to reveal row after row of carved characters, angular, deliberate, cut deep enough that even packed earth could not soften their edges, unmistakably runic to anyone who has ever seen an Old Norse inscription. The year was 1898. Near the small town of Kensington, Minnesota, a Swedish immigrant farmer named Olof Oman was clearing land, the same slow, backbreaking work of pulling stumps and stones out of new ground that every homesteader in that part of the country knew by heart, when he found the roots of an aspen tree gripping a flat stone slab covered edge to edge in runes. The inscription, once translated by scholars eager to make sense of it, told a startling story. A party of Norwegian and Swedish explorers, far from the coast, deep in what is now the American interior, recording a violent encounter that had cost several of their men their lives, and dating the carving itself to the year 1362, a date carved with the same careful precision as the runes around it. If that inscription was genuine, it meant Scandinavian explorers had pushed deep into the heart of North America more than a century before Columbus ever left a Spanish port behind him. Not just a coastal landing, not just a brief Newfoundland outpost hugging the shoreline, but hundreds of miles inland, carved in stone by men who expected no one to read it for centuries, and left behind as proof that they had come and gone, and paid a price for it. It is hard to overstate how badly people wanted that story to be true, in a country still building its own origin myths out of whatever evidence it could find. And it is just as hard to overstate how quickly it fell apart once real expert scrutiny reached it. Every serious rune scholar who examined the Kensington stone, running fingers over the same grooves the farmer had brushed clean, noticed the same problem. The grammar, the spelling, and the specific letter forms used in the inscription do not match 14th century Old Norse at all. They match 19th century Scandinavian dialects instead, the everyday, familiar language spoken by immigrant farmers living in Minnesota at the exact time the stone was supposedly discovered lying in that field. The scholarly consensus, essentially unanimous by the time all the linguistic evidence was weighed, is that the Kensington Runestone is a forgery, almost certainly carved sometime close to 1898, rather than 1362. That should have closed the case completely, filed away as a curious piece of immigrant-era folk art. It has not, because nobody has ever proven exactly who carved it, or why they went to such trouble for a stone destined to sit in a field. Was it Oman himself, a skilled hoaxer with a private motive nobody around him ever suspected? Was it a neighbor, a joke that got wildly out of hand once the newspapers arrived? Was it a piece of immigrant pride dressed up as ancient proof that Scandinavians belonged in America long before anyone else could claim the same ground? Every name that has ever been floated in over a century of speculation remains a theory, not a confession, and no one has ever stepped forward. And the puzzle does not stop at ink and grammar and old dialects. In 2016, geological examination of the carved grooves, using tools no 19th century farmer or scholar could have imagined, found something that should not be possible if the stone had truly sat in wet Minnesota ground for centuries the way its story demanded. The cuts remained sharp-edged, crisp, almost fresh to the touch, as if carved recently rather than worn down by 536 years of frost, thaw, and moisture, grinding at stone the way that climate always does. That kind of weathering is exactly what a genuinely ancient inscription should show, and this one simply does not show it. Physically, the stone behaves like a much younger object dressed up and pretending to be an old one. So the Kensington Runestone sits in an unusual position, half debunked and half unsolved at the same time. Historians are about as confident as they can be that it is fake. The linguistics and the geology both point the same direction. And yet the person who made it got away completely clean. No trial, no confession, no name attached with any certainty, more than 100 years later and counting. Even a forgery, it turns out, can guard a real secret just as tightly as anything genuinely ancient. Whoever cut those runes into that rock, buried a hoax in a Minnesota field, and let a farmer stumble onto it while clearing stumps, took the truth of who they were, and why they did it straight to the grave with them. And that, strangely, puts a fake stone from a Minnesota field in the exact same company as every other object on this list. An artifact that refuses, right down to this year, to give up its final answer. 10 artifacts, 10 verdicts history never quite got to finish. Unexplained, unavenged, undeciphered, unholy, impossible, unclaimed, unaccounted for, unnamed, empty, unconfessed. Every single one of those objects is real, sitting behind glass in a museum, or still half buried in a field somewhere, daring modern science to explain it anyway. And maybe that is the real lesson buried underneath 1,000 years of shrouds, swords, stolen kings, and empty buckets. History is not a finished book with every page filled in. It is scaffolding built around rooms we still cannot fully open, and every generation gets a little closer before the next mystery turns up to replace the one we just solved. If you made it all the way from a shroud in Turin to a forged stone in a Minnesota field, you already know more about the medieval world's unsolved cases than most people ever will. So pick one, just one, the single artifact on this list you would stake your own reputation on solving, and go defend it in the comments, because somebody down there is convinced you are wrong. And if any of these 10 mysteries got under your skin, subscribe, because history keeps digging up questions like this one, and you will want to be there when the next impossible object comes out of the ground.